early films that I mentioned were an hour or an hour and a half at best. And the Civil War was supposed to be 5 1-hours, which grew to 11 and a half. And baseball was supposed to be 5 hours and ended up 18 and a half hours long. And as I was working on it, I realized in a kind of perverse way that baseball was the sequel to the Civil War. And as people, I say this to people and they say, you're out of your mind. And I said, Shelby Foote said that the Civil War was the defining moment in our history. We think of our history, for some reason, as just wars and generals and presidents. The political, military narrative has for too long stood for what history is in this country. And it is a fairly accurate but superficial barometer of where the country had been. But if you really want to know about its guts, about its heart, about its soul, you have to involve yourself with things that aren't just limited to the political military narrative, or to so delve into them as to do justice to who we are and the complexity of what makes up the totality of American life. So here was this subject, apparently innocent, not really considered a mainstream topic by historians, that was dealing with race, that was dealing with labor and management, that was dealing with the exclusion of women, that was dealing with the growth and decay and rebirth of cities, that was dealing with the nature of heroes and villains and fools, that was dealing with immigration and assimilation and the sense and badge of citizenship that comes not just from a piece of paper from the State Department, but participation in the so-called national pastime of your adopted land. So that involved in the story of baseball, it seemed to me, was a question about what we had become from that defining moment, from that crossroads of our being that Shelby mentioned. And in the course of doing the baseball film, I had the opportunity to record an interview with a superb writer and essayist who teaches English and African American studies at Washington University in St. Louis, a man named Gerald Early. And Gerald Early said this remarkable thing to me, a statement that worked its way instantly into the introduction of the baseball series. He said that when they study, and I assume he means archaeologists, when they study our American civilization 2,000 years from now, and 2,000 years from now, think about the change in the last 2,000, it will only be exponentially greater in what happens to this world if it's still around. When they study our American civilization 2,000 years from now, Americans will be known for only 3 things: the Constitution, baseball, and jazz music. They're the 3 most beautiful things, he said, Americans have ever designed. And it got me thinking. I had given a speech on black soldiers in the Civil War at the Metropolitan Museum a couple of years before I interviewed Gerald Early, and there in the front row was Wynton Marsalis. And when I finished, he came up and he gave me a hug. It's as if we had known each other all our lives. And he said, you know what you should do next is jazz. And you know, I sort of looked at him and I said, I'm really pleased to meet you, but I didn't say this. Don't tell me what to do next. I decided I'm going to do one. How would you like me to say you should compose this or play this? But he did plant that seed. And then Gerald Early said this remarkable thing. And as I was editing the baseball series, I found more and more that the central pivotal episodes of that series, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, were coming alive by using a music that I did not know that well. When I grew up here, I had only a half dozen jazz records. My father played some jazz. I sold a lot of jazz at discount records, but I was a child of rock and roll and R&B, and it did not influence me. It didn't affect my consciousness. I was distracted by this more superficial, it turns out, pop sound. But all of a sudden, here I was using jazz, and it was coming together. I'm curious about how my country works, and there were these incredible equivalents where you could put a piece of music, you could take Mood Indigo and apply it to this particularly rueful memory that Stud Sterkel had about the 1929 World Series. And it didn't just work. It was the sum of these 2 things were greater, you know, than the parts. It was an amazing epiphany for me. And at that moment I realized that I was not just working on the sequel to the Civil War series, but that I was engaged in the middle panel of a triptych, a trilogy that would have to necessarily deal with jazz music, the only art form that Americans have invented. And it got me thinking, and I went back to Gerald Early's statement, and I ran it over and over again in my mind, and I thought about it, and I realized that I think what Gerald Early was saying is that the genius of America is improvisation. The Constitution, ladies and gentlemen, is 4 pieces of paper. That's it. 4 pieces of paper written at the end of the 18th century that's able to adjudicate our most complicated problems in this, the new 21st century, except for Florida. Which is an amazing improvisational thing. It was unheard of in humankind to have that kind of flexibility. This language of the Constitution is not poetic, it's flexible. And it permits infinite permutations. And with very few amendments, we have actually been able to govern this seemingly ungovernable mass and continent for a long, long time, and done it despite all the glaring and obvious flaws, a lot better than everybody else. And it's been an amazing improvisational document. And at the heart of our national pastime